to click enter. So today's webinar will be given by Doug Folsom. We're excited to have him present on the topic of personal protective equipment, something that all of us should be aware of and should use on a regular basis. Doug.
Thanks, Jason. Let's get the ball over here.
I thought I clicked and I had not.
There we go. You see my screen?
I can see your screen.
Excellent. So let's get going. So good morning, everybody. Glad to be here, and I'm glad you're all here with us. Today we're talking about personal protective equipment. Now, personal protective equipment, there's a lot of stuff to this topic, and so obviously more than just a safety moment. So today we're going to give you the helicopter view and talk about, what are our general duties and responsibilities when it comes to personal protective equipment. And then each of the different types of personal protective equipment, of course, have a lot more detailed information that you may want to look into, or you can check with us to see any additional training that you may need or want on in a greater detail. But let's start talking a little bit just about some statistical information when it comes to, why use personal protective equipment or what the benefit is. Of course, you might think that's kind of obvious. A lot of people get hurt on the job. We have about 2 million work-related injuries every year in the United States. About a quarter of those 2 million, so about 500,000 of those injuries, are to the head, eyes, hands, or feet. Obviously parts of our body that we're most likely can have some sort of personal protective equipment to help protect those. When we talk about the head, if we look at injuries that happen while people are wearing a hard hat, that only accounts for about 16% of head injuries. In other words, we have about 84% of all head injuries happen to people not wearing a hard hat. So kind of clear that that would help if we were, using the personal protective equipment. Injuries to the face, only about 1% of injuries to the face are incurred while someone is wearing, a protective device for their face. So 99% of all injuries to the face happen without personal protective equipment. Foot injuries, 23% of foot injuries happen to people who are wearing a safety shoe, which means 77% of all foot injuries happen to people who aren't even wearing a safety shoe. So that's obviously something that we should have some opportunity to be able to prevent some injuries there. Eye protection, about 40% of eye injuries happen while someone's wearing eye protection. And that kind of sounds like the worst one. That sounds like kind of a high failure rate, but maybe it is a call to pay attention to what is the type of eye protection that we have, and maybe even being a little overconfident as to what we expose ourselves to, because even with proper eye protection on, things can still blow around the edges sometimes. So, but 60% of eye injuries happen to people not wearing any eye protection at all. So when we're talking about the need for personal protective equipment, we need to back up just a little bit. We want to talk about how do we assess the hazards that are going on in the workplace. And when we are doing a hazard assessment, we're looking at how to protect our employees from specific hazards. The first thing we should be asking ourselves isn't, should we have personal protective equipment here, but is, can this hazard be eliminated? That's the first thing we want to try and do, is eliminate hazards wherever possible so that there's no need for any kind of protection. If I decide I want to never be in a car accident, it's easy. I just don't get in a car. I eliminate the hazard and the accident won't happen. Well, sometimes that may be doable for certain types of hazards, but lots of times we can't just avoid the hazard. So we need to take it to the next step and look at, well, how else can we control this hazard? And the next thing we should consider are engineering controls, physical changes to the workplace, to the processes, to the tools that will create that barrier or keep us away from those hazards. So that's going to be the next best way to deal with a hazard, is to engineer a control into that hazard. If that doesn't work, or if that's not feasible, then we need to look at administrative controls. That is, making rules about how we operate around a hazard. If we can, make a rule where we isolate hazards in a specific area and have a rule that employees can't go in those areas, then we are again, we're protecting ourselves without the need to go to personal protective equipment. When we're using personal protective equipment is when we actually have to be exposed to that hazard, and there's no way to really otherwise control that. And so personal protective equipment, that is our last line of defense. That's the last thing we're going to look at doing when we're trying to determine how to protect our employees from hazards in the workplace. So what is personal protective equipment? Well, we are talking about a barrier between our bodies, ourselves, and whatever that hazard may be. And there's a lot of different types of hazards and different types of personal protective equipment. It's important to recognize no personal protective equipment is perfect and can guarantee that we'll be kept safe from hazards. That's why it's important to look at hazard elimination and engineering controls and administrative controls, because those are much more effective in keeping us away from a hazard than the personal protective equipment. And so even though no personal protective equipment is perfect, it may be necessary, and there are circumstances where we have to engage the hazard, and so we're going to need some level of protection there, but we have to make sure that we know what we're using, how to use it, and make sure that we actually, are employing that protection. So will you be ready for the unexpected? I don't put my safety glasses on because I know something's about to fly into my eyeball. I got to put those safety glasses on before I know something's going to happen to me. Otherwise, it doesn't do me any good. If I wait for the hazard to be hurting me, it's too late to put the personal protective equipment on. So we've got to be ready to use it. There's different types of personal protective equipment. You have protection for your face, your head, your hands, your feet, your lungs, and your respiratory system, your hearing, your whole body. Fall protection is another type of personal protective equipment, that we may look at. Now, when it comes to the specifics on these, I'm going to touch on some of them, but again, we're going to be kind of doing the helicopter view so that we stay within the promised time period here. But if you have any questions about any specifics or hazard analysis or anything like that that you'd like some help with, please feel free to contact us so that we can help you with that. When we're looking at selecting a certain personal protective equipment, we want to make sure we take a look at the specific job, the cutting, the welding, the using the table saw, whatever it is, a specific job that we've got going on. We need to evaluate that job. And while doing that, of course, first of all, we're going to eliminate, engineer, or administer out the hazard. But when we can't, then we need to identify what is the right PPE for that job, what's going to give us the protection that we need. Often this means we need to look at some selection guidelines to help us understand what personal protective equipment will provide the necessary level of protection for a given job. You also may consult with experts. You can give us a call, or you can talk to vendors who are selling the equipment that can answer specific questions about what level of protection different individual pieces of protective equipment will provide. And that becomes very important. For example, you can, look at a table that will give you an idea, with a given chemical exposure, what kind of glove do we need to have? Not all gloves are going to give the same amount of protection. Some gloves may be permeable, so a chemical could soak through them. That doesn't do us any good. Other gloves may be susceptible to penetration or degradation when exposed to a certain chemical. And so that may not be the best solution. So we need to make sure that depending on the exposure that we're selecting the right glove, just using gloves as an example. So make sure that when we're selecting the PPE that we're going through a process of determining what kind of protection we need and what equipment is going to provide that needed protection. Once we've identified personal protective equipment, we have to train our employees on when it's necessary to use that personal protective equipment. For example, are you using pneumatic tools so that you've got compressed air that could be blowing dirt and debris and things around? You require at that time, anytime you're using a pneumatic tool, you must have your eye protection on, for example. So we're training employees on when the PPE is necessary, what type of PPE is necessary, how to properly put on, take off, adjust, and wear that PPE so that it does the job that we need it to. And another really important factor that we need to cover with our employees is what is the limitation of that personal protective equipment. Because like we said, no personal protective equipment is perfect, and some things actually won't even work for protecting us against certain hazards. So we need to know what that is, and we'll give some examples as we go through here of things that illustrate the limitations of different types of personal protective equipment. Employees also need to understand what is the proper care maintenance of the equipment. We also need to understand what is the useful life of that personal protective equipment. A hard hat, for example, shouldn't be used beyond 5 years, from when it was put into service. Also, the webbing and the support structure inside of a hard hat should be replaced probably every 12 months. And so we understand, that there is a useful life associated with this personal protective equipment, so that we're always changing it out when it needs to be changed out, so that we have equipment being used that will give us the protection that we need. How do we dispose of that personal protective equipment, when we're done with it too, where there may be requirements on that disposal? We need to think about some documentation as well. We need to, when we're looking at a specific hazard that we're trying to protect our employees from, we should document the process that we go through, the hazard analysis or the job safety analysis that we go through that helps us identify how we're going to protect our employees from that hazard, and specifically documenting what personal protective equipment has been identified as necessary for that particular job or protection from that particular hazard. We also need to document that employees have been trained. So that training roster with the names of who's been trained and what was trained on and who was the instructor and when was that training done, so that we have that documentation that employees have received the necessary and required training. Also, we talked about limitations of personal protective equipment, and here's a big one right here. The biggest limitation of PPE is not using it. So those goggles on his head are not doing his eyes a whole lot of good up there. And so, what are the limitations? Of course, non-use is a big one, but misuse is also an important limitation, and that's where we need to make sure that we're training employees on how their personal protective equipment works and how to properly use it. Improper selection, if we choose the wrong chemical glove, for example, we may not have adequate protection, or that glove may not give us the same level or duration of protection that we would expect. So that's also a limitation, having the right equipment, making sure that we're wearing it properly. What's the permeation or penetration factors? How long will that glove protect against exposure to a specific chemical or liquid, for example? How long does it take something to break through, or the permeation rate, whether that's a liquid, or even looking at gloves if we're looking for protection from a cut or puncture, what is the level of protection that that particular glove provides for us? For example, degradation, also the example of the hard hat needing to be replaced every 5 years, is an example of degradation, because those plastics, once they're exposed to the sunlight and other things that are on the job site, that plastic starts to degrade, and pretty soon it won't give that same protection that it was designed to give. And so we need to understand what these limitations are of our personal protective equipment. We also need to train employees on how to identify if the personal protective equipment is good to use, if it's in good condition. I need to look at that hard hat, look for cracks in the shell, inspect the support structure to make sure that it's attached, that nothing's torn or ripped or broken in there, that it's not fraying. And so we need to understand, how do we inspect the personal protective equipment each time before we use it to make sure it's going to give us the protection that we need. Gloves would be another example. If a glove has a little hole in it, it's not going to give us a lot of protection. So, checking those out to make sure that they're in good condition and ready to use. Some PPE, Some types of gloves, for example, are single use. And when it's single use, that really means single use. Use it once and get rid of it. We're not trying to save money or time by reusing something that's only intended to be used one time or a limited number of times. So be aware of those limitations and when we're training employees as well. The worker has certain responsibilities. Generally, when we're talking about safety and OSHA rules and requirements and everything, we talk about the things that the employer must do because the employer may get a citation. Well, there's certain things that the employee must do per OSHA regulation as well. And when it comes to personal protective equipment, the employee is required by OSHA regulation to wear the identified personal protective equipment. If your employer has identified that you must wear these safety glasses or this hard hat during these activities, then you must wear it. Also, we have to make sure that it is used as intended, that we take care of it so that it's clean and sanitary and maintained in good condition, and that you're inspecting it every time you use it and say something to your employer if there's something wrong with the personal protective equipment, so we can make sure that it gets replaced and we're not using defective personal protective equipment. So those are responsibilities that we all have, especially employees, when it comes to the use of personal protective equipment. Now let's talk about some specific protection, and probably the biggest one we think about is protecting our eyes. Just about anybody who's not spending all day working in an office environment probably ought to have some form of eye protection, because we're out in environments where we can get things blowing into our eyes or things are flying around. So that's probably one of the most common ones. I would think that just about any employee outside of an administrative function, outside of an office, should have a pair of safety glasses. When we are selecting the proper glasses to use for eye protection, we should be looking for a Z87 designation somewhere stamped onto that safety glasses. Usually it's on the side piece, on the inside of the side piece. It'll say Z87 on there, and that tells us that those safety glasses meet a specific engineered standard to protect someone's eyes against impact resistance, for one thing. And so we want to make sure that we're selecting a tool that is going to provide the protection. So look for those designations. Also for welding and cutting and things, we may need certain shielding or shades in the eye protection to help protect your eyes from being burned as well. So those are things we may need to consider and look at. A real common mistake we see out there is with grinding, that when we have a piece of equipment, that we're actually required to wear the Z87 safety glasses in conjunction with a full face shield. And you can see lots of times we'll see the full face shield there by the grinder, but we need to be wearing the safety glasses as well, because the safety glasses provide that impact resistance. And you can see from this picture that just the face shield alone may not provide that impact or penetration protection, that we need all by itself. So when grinding, remember, we need to use Z87 safety glasses and a full face shield together at the same time, because we want to avoid the following. And look away if you don't like to see things sticking in eyeballs, but this is definitely not something that you want to have happen to you at work today. And so we want to make sure that we protect our eyes. They're one of the most valuable senses that we have, and we want to make sure that we're protecting those every day. Another common protection we need to look at is our heads. You can get very serious injuries, even fatal injuries, by impacts to the head, and so we need to understand, where necessary, the proper selection of hard hats. And there's two different types of hard hats, general types of hard hats. There's a type 1 hard hat that protects you from vertical drop hazards, things coming down straight down from above onto your head. And then there's a type 2 hard hat that is designed to protect your head from vertical and lateral impacts. And so it's very important to make sure that you select the proper type of head protection depending on what the hazards are that you're seeking protection from. So type 2, definitely more versatile protection for you. And then we also have hard hats that give protection against electrical exposure. So you have type 1 or type 2 in conjunction with these exposures for electricity. And so if we have people who are working with electricity, linemen and so forth, we need to make sure that we're selecting a hard hat that's appropriate for the level of exposure that they may be dealing with. And so look for that as well. In addition to the impact protection, we need to be possibly considering the conductivity of the hard hat or lack thereof, hopefully. So we are looking for electrical protection or, no electrical protection depending on what's needed there. We also may look at specific types of other head protection depending on the specific activities. If we've got search and rescue, there may be specific head protection we want to have available, or maybe we got people on ATVs, for example. There may be special helmets that we want to make sure people are using. Remember, a hard hat can be knocked off easily. So if we're in a situation where it's climbing or on a vehicle, we want to make sure we're selecting head protection that will stay secure on the head. Another common area that we try to protect with personal protective equipment is our feet. So foot protection can be something that injuries happen real frequently, and we want to protect our feet against heavy or sharp objects that may fall on our feet, or things that may roll over our foot and crush our foot, or where we may step on objects that may actually penetrate the shoe and penetrate our foot at the same time as well. So we want to make sure we are selecting a safety shoe if we're working in conditions where those types of hazards may occur. Just like with your safety glasses, you're looking for a Z87. On your safety shoe, you're looking for an ANSI Z41 designation or an ASTM F2413 designation. So you may see both of those numbers on a safety shoe, Z41 or F2413. Those are usually going to be stamped on the sole of the shoe right in front of the heel. Generally, if you're looking at a shoe. So in selecting a shoe, that's what we're going to be looking for. These shoes are going to have a steel or composite toe box to protect your foot from a crushing hazard. They're also going to have puncture-resistant soles to protect your foot from things penetrating the shoe and likewise penetrating your feet. And depending on the type of work that's being done, we may need to consider whether it's the appropriate shoe for working around electrical applications. So you may, if you have people working with electricity, we may want to require that it be a metal-free safety shoe, for example. And there's various styles of shoes. These shoes can look like sneakers and tennis shoes. They can look like office dress shoes and still meet the Z41 standard, or they, are like the more common one you think of in a boot, but they can come in a lot of different styles depending on the work that is being done. Of course, if you're working on uneven surfaces, we highly recommend a boot. We see a lot of people getting injuries to their feet and to their ankles, because they roll their ankle while walking on an uneven surface. So that boot obviously can give a little bit more support to your ankle. And so that's another thing that the boot can do to help out. Another thing we may be looking to protect ourselves or our employees from is hearing protection. So Jason's there at the Dixie Center complaining about the loud vacuum cleaner. Well, how loud is it? Is it so loud that prolonged exposure could potentially lead to hearing loss? And when we have hearing loss, it happens because these little hair cells called stereocilia in our ears get damaged. And you can see in this picture some of these little cells, some of these little hair cells are laying flat or they're pushed over. And those are ones that have been damaged and they're not going to work again. And so you can have permanent hearing loss. And this happens from overexposure. When we're talking about sound exposure, we're looking at how loud it is and what is the duration of that exposure. So we generally will look at a time-weighted average of the sound exposure to determine if hearing protection is required or what level of hearing protection is required. So that information is very important. Knowing, if you suspect you have some really noisy processes going on, we need to get an idea of how noisy they are so that we can, first of all, decide whether we need protection at all, and then second of all, figure out, what level of protection we need. So this is usually going to be done by doing some noise sampling and doing an actual time-weighted average of the exposure that individual employees will be exposed to while they're working. And so there is specialized equipment. We actually have some specialized equipment here at the Trust for doing this. And so, example, the greater the time-weighted average exposure, the less time an employee should be exposed to that level of exposure during their work shift. So a real common one we might look at is like the power lawnmower there, which on average may put off about 107 decibels. If we look at that at about 105 decibels, less than that, we're limited to a 30-minute exposure there. So definitely running a mower would be something that we should be looking at hearing protection in conjunction with that job. And so we need to think about other jobs as well, whether we need hearing protection on those. But it's not just the hearing protection, putting something in or over our ears, but we may also consider other ways to remember to eliminate, to engineer, or administer away those hazards. So, isolating yourself from the noise. Have the noisy equipment in a separate room that's closed off and keeps that noise isolated, or putting baffling or mufflers, on a noisy piece of equipment to help keep that exposure down, or by limiting the amount of time. That would be an administrative control, is to limit the amount of time anyone can be exposed to that noisy area. So it's not always, remember, it's not PPE first, it's PPE last, and we look at other ways of controlling our hazards as well. Respiratory protection, this is a pretty significant topic. That is a training in and of itself to talk about respiratory protection and respiratory protection programs. But if we do identify that there is a need in our workplace for respiratory protection, we want to make sure that we have a respiratory protection program in place. It's important, again, to select the proper type of PPE. If you have air purifying respiratory protection like the cartridge filter, that's only going to filter out certain impurities that specific cartridge is designed to filter out. And so it's not going to provide you with oxygen. And if it's the wrong filter, for the wrong exposure, it may not provide the right protection. So we need to make sure that we're checking our safety data sheets and making sure we have the right filtering cartridges for the right exposure, or, if it's an IDLH exposure, immediately dangerous to life and health depending on the exposure, having an SCBA, a self-contained breathing apparatus. So again, very important to make sure we're selecting the right type of respiratory protection. Filtering face pieces like this N95 particle mask could fall under, or does fall underneath, the respiratory protection program. So if you identify an N95 filtering face piece as necessary personal protective equipment for your employees, you also need to have the entire respiratory protection program in place. And so that's very important. You can have your employees, voluntarily use those, in which we would use the Appendix D disclaimer or waiver for the employees. And so they can choose to use that N95 mask. But if you require it, then you must have a respiratory protection program in place. Retroreflective clothing would be another thing you may want to consider if you have employees working in the traffic control zone or in the right-of-way or near the right-of-way. We need to make sure that they are visible, and we're looking for performance class 2 or 3 retroreflective clothing. And it's not just if we're on the highway or in the streets, but if we're working in a gravel pit or in the landfill or someplace where we have employees on the ground with moving equipment, we need to make sure that people have high visibility and may consider the need for retroreflective high visibility clothing as well. Often the question comes up as to who pays for PPE. Generally, the employer needs to identify what PPE is required, and generally the employee is going to be providing that PPE for their employees. However, sometimes you may have specialty personal protective equipment, shoes that the employee takes home, or prescription eyewear. The employee may be required to pay for that themselves. However, the employer may also choose to provide that also, depending on the employer. If the equipment is lost or intentionally damaged, it's possible that the employer may require that to be paid for by the employee. And just kind of a last note, don't forget PPE is just as important at home or in your leisure time as it is on the job. You can lose the use of your hands, feet, your eyes, your ears, just the same from your personal activities as you can at work. So make sure you're protecting yourself regardless of whether you're on or off the clock. So in summary, make sure as employers especially that we're assessing hazards, that we make sure we do everything we can to eliminate those hazards or control them through engineering or administrative rules. When we can't eliminate hazards or control them through engineering and administrative rules, then we want to make sure that we're selecting the proper personal protective equipment, that we're training our employees on the proper use and maintenance and inspection and care of that personal protective equipment, and that supervisors are following up to make sure employees are doing what they've been trained to do and using the personal protective equipment when it's required. Make sure you document your efforts in analyzing hazards and doing hazard assessments and job safety analysis and identification of PPE, and also make sure you're documenting your training and any other follow-up activities that you have with your employees associated with their use of personal protective equipment. Jason, do we have any questions?
Let's get some questions. Oh, let's see. I got a couple. Let's see. They came in the Q&A. Actually, just comments. Debbie said, thank you. Learned a few new ideas. And she does have a question. What about encouraging workers to want to wear PPE? How can
well, that definitely could be part of training. So when we train employees, when I train people, my goal is to motivate, hopefully. And so, training ideally in the perfect world is going to be more than just, the dry, boring, bits and pieces of information that people need, but also, some stories and examples of things that will help motivate employees to use their PPE. So that's something that can be a part of training as far as the motivation goes. But there's also the shooting the hostage. So remember, using the PPE, it's not an option. You are required as an employer to identify the proper PPE and to train your employees to use it. Your employees are required to use it. It's not optional. So in addition to trying to motivate them, of course, if you have, violations of the requirement to use the PPE, sometimes you may need to put some disciplinary action in place and show your employees that you have a zero tolerance for not using the personal protective equipment.
All right. I think that looks like all the questions we have, Doug. Thank you very much. Brent, anything to add?
No, good job, Doug.
Thanks, Brent.
All right.
And thank you, everybody, for tuning in. We appreciate you participating in our webinars and in all of our training programs. Again, if you have any questions about the specifics of any of these different types of PPE or selection or training of your employees or whatever it is, give Jason, Brent, or myself a call, shoot us an email, and let us know, what your questions are. We're here to help you work these things out.
Awesome. Thanks, Doug. Appreciate it. Remember, folks, we're going to have our live safety committee meeting. We'll start at 10 o'clock. We'll be starting up that webinar here in just a few minutes. And if not, go out and have a safe day. Okay.